I got to the address at 11:57 p.m. The streets had already lost whatever life they had during the day. Sodium lights hummed, and the air smelled of old rain. I kept the engine idling while I checked the app for special instructions. It said back door and showed a pin at the end of small dead-end street. I grabbed my flashlight, picked up the insulated delivery bag, and stepped out of the car. There was a rhythm to deliveries at night. You move fast, you keep your head down, you pretend you are invisible. That night, the houses were farther apart than they looked on a map. The pin led me to a house with a high hedge, gate closed but unlocked. When I pushed the gate, it squealed like it had been waiting. I walked up the path and saw a single back window, dim amber light spilling onto the lawn. The back door was ajar, the kind of ajar that never happens by accident. I clicked on my flashlight and eased the door open, announcing myself in the robot-friendly delivery voice I used at 3 in the morning. "Delivery," I said. "Hey, I have a drop for you." There was no answer. The house smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemons, like hotels that try too hard to be clean. I set the bag on the tile and checked the app to confirm a name. No name, just an order number. I knocked on the door frame with my knuckles and leaned my shoulder against the wood. A slow shuffle came from the hallway. A figure appeared, wearing a robe that sagged like wet fabric. No face showed at first, just the hollow where a face should have been, like someone had scooped it out and placed a shadow there. "You delivered it," the voice said. It was a whisper and a complaint at once. I pointed to the bag. "Right here, man. Sign on the app if you can." They took a step forward. The robe hung differently as they moved, like the air around them was listening. I offered the phone. Their hand brushed the screen, cold, dry, and the app hiccuped. The signature box filled with ink that didn't look like ink. It looked like a smear of something dark that dried and flaked off my phone when I tried to wipe it. The figure's face turned toward me. For a second, I thought I saw eyes, small and burned out, but then the face rearranged itself, like skin settling over nothing. They smiled. "You should leave now," they said. "You have one more stop." I laughed, because you always laugh when your body tries to make a joke of fear. "App shows this is your address." They tilted their head. "There is another, down the lane. The driver before you did not come back." Their voice was the kind that carried a suggestion wrapped in pity. I was still a few blocks from my next drop, and I had two options: push the route forward and finish the shift, or get back in the car and drive the route like a normal, boring human. My shift pay depended on the number of deliveries. I took out my phone and scrolled the map. The lane was a squiggle on the GPS, unlabeled, as if the cartographer had run out of ink. I followed the lane because curiosity is a shape of greed. The lane narrowed until trees leaned in like hands. My headlights caught something white on the route, then nothing. I slowed and pulled over. Rain had started again, tapping the windshield like fingernails. A road sign exaggerated its glow in the water on my dash. The lane led to a relict of a mobile home park, half the trailers gone, the other half sullen and patched. All the porch lights were out. I tightened my jacket and walked with the bag. A man sat on the steps of the nearest trailer, hunched and clutching his knees. He looked at me like he had been waiting for the entire night. Up close, I saw his mouth was clamped shut with a strip of pale tape. His lips moved silently. He raised a finger and pointed at a trailer deeper in the lot. I approached the open door of that trailer. The inside smelled like fried grease and old paper. Mail fluttered like birds on the counter. A single bulb hung from a frayed cord. On the table was a stack of papers, each stamped with a logo from the delivery company and each sealed shut with the same dark smear I had seen on my phone. The top sheet had a date that was last month, and under a line written in shaky ink, "Stop helping them." My phone buzzed. A notification: "New delivery assigned. Address: your vehicle." My hand went cold. When I ran back to the car, the man on the steps was gone. In the driver's seat, a package sat where I'd left mine. My hands were trembling as I grabbed the keys. The engine turned and the headlights flooded the lot. But in the corner of my vision, someone had pressed their face to the glass of a trailer window and mouthed, unseen, a single word. I got out of there. I drove until dawn scraped the clouds, and the map finally offered a populated street. I checked the app history, and every one of my deliveries from the night had the same signature. A streak of something dark and crusted, labeled as confirmed. The last entry read, in place of a name, for words typed like an address, drop where you sleep. I did not open my apartment door that morning without a crowbar. The bed was made. My phone sat on the nightstand with the app open. There were 2 unread notifications. One read, "Thank you." The other was my own dead phone number, signed by someone who promised they would see me on my next shift. I quit 2 weeks later. I worked Route 16 for 2 nights before I noticed a pattern. At first it felt like a string of weird coincidences. Houses with identical carved pumpkins on the porches, even though it was not October. Stair lights that came on as I approached and stayed on long enough for me to think of eyes. Packages left on porches with no names. By the 3rd night, the app started recommending a shorter route, then routing me back through empty blocks like someone was redrawing my path while I was driving it. Drivers talk about the algorithm like it is an arbiter of fate. It has moods. It loves speed. It hates hesitation. On night shifts, it develops a staccato personality. Route 16 hated me. I should have stopped when my radio began to pick up static that sounded like whispering. Instead, I followed the directions to a long, low house at the end of a cul-de-sac. The porch light flashed in a pattern like someone counting. When I laid the package on the stoop, there was already a damp patch on the doormat shaped like a hand. I rang the bell, because once you ring the bell, you can leave with the job technically done. An old woman opened the door, and for a second I thought I recognized her, but I could not place from where. She wore a coat, zipped to her throat, as if the house itself refused to heat up. "You are early," she said. "Get the next one right." I asked her what she meant. She pointed over my shoulder without moving, like her finger was a compass needle that knew the wrong direction. I turned and looked down the walkway. Someone had written numbers in the dirt with a stick. They were tiny, obsessive numbers counting down. When I checked the app, the next address was blank, replaced with a small blinking icon that said open. I tapped it and a message appeared. Do not stop on the bridge. I drove on. The map sent me across a short bridge that crossed a canal like a seam in the town. The bridge had no streetlight. Halfway across, my headlights picked out a figure standing in the center, facing away. They held a lantern, but it was unlit. Their hair was too long and clung to their back like wet rope. When I pulled up, they turned. The face was a brightness, an exposed tooth set in a grin that gleamed like a coin. A sound like a laugh and a sob mixed together escaped from them. I swallowed and kept the engine running. "You should not deliver there," they said. "That house no longer takes packages." The app buzzed. A new instruction flashed. Ring bell. Invite in. Return to vehicle. I felt the laugh come out of me like bile. The instructions were a loop. I did what it said because drivers do not argue with the route. I rang the bell. A man opened the door and beckoned me inside. He moved with a slow deliberateness, like someone whose day never ended and who had practiced the specific gestures needed to keep a visitor calm. Inside, the living room was lined with shelves of model trucks and boxes of thermally insulated bags, all labeled with names I did not know. There were dozens of them, and in the middle of the room, a television hummed with static. "Sit," the man said, and his mouth made a motion like it had rehearsed hospitality. "Tell me where you deliver." I told him. He listened and then wrote each address on a pad in a hand that trembled with a thin, accurate fervor. When he reached the last entry, he folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. He handed me a cup of tea that tasted of metal and old pennies. I meant to refuse, but the cup was warm and it felt like a bribe. My phone would not show the app. When I opened it, the map displayed a simple grid of tiny houses. One of the squares was blinking. Inside the blinking square was an icon of a small bed. Under it, a single instruction, deliver to bed. I drove until the roads turned into alleys and alleys into footpaths. The blinking square moved with me, always a step ahead, choosing which streets would exist and which would evaporate. Every time I stopped to leave a package, a figure watched from a doorway and folded their hands like a judge. At each stop, a paper tag would appear on the door handle, served. At the second to last stop, I found a child asleep on the couch, face pressed to a pillow, breathing shallow. A teddy bear lay beside them with a stitched smile. On the teddy bear's foot, someone had sewn a tiny uniform patch, the same logo my company used. When I set the package on the table, it felt like placing a stone on a grave. I did not notice the man watching from the hallway until he stepped forward. He had the look of a man who had been reduced to very small acts of control. "You must never deliver to where you sleep," he said. "You will be followed." I thought he meant footsteps or a neighbor's stare. I did not realize what he meant until I found my own bed that night, and the curtains were drawn tight with dozens of tiny tags pinned along the hem, each with the word "served" scrawled across them in tiny letters. The next day, I handed in my uniform. They asked me why. I showed them the tags. They laughed. They said, "People do strange things at night." They did not check my bag. The night shift has creaks you learn to listen to. The hum of the van, the squeal of a seatbelt, the undercurrent of the city breathing. I learned a different set of creaks when I started taking the long, late runs to the industrial edge of town. Those streets are where the city's discarded things wait with their own patient histories. It was a Tuesday when the app assigned me a cluster of addresses that looked like a scatter of stars on a blank patch of road. The customer notes said only one word: "Please." The pay was higher than usual. Someone, somewhere, wanted me out there. I pulled up to the first address, a low building with a roll-up metal door. Light leaked from tiny cracks. A man in a mechanic's jacket met me and signed without looking at the phone. He took the package like he had been expecting it for years. "You do more than deliver," he said. I told him I just drove. He laughed, and the sound echoed off aluminum siding. "Not tonight. Tonight you carry things between places. That matters." I went on to the next stop, and the next, and each time someone met me at the threshold with the same tired gratitude. An older woman with oil on her hands tucked a note into the bag that said, "Bless you for the burden." A man with a construction vest set down a candle and said, "Light it when you leave." I began to feel like a courier for something older than the app. At one stop, a boy no older than 12 stood at the edge of an abandoned lot and watched me with eyes that had the tiredness of old men. He reached out and touched my sleeve. His fingers left a film on my cuff that flaked off later like ash. At a warehouse near the edge of the route, I saw a row of people in front of folding tables. They were not buying anything. They were sitting with wrapped packages, unwrapping and rewrapping them, pressing something small into each parcel before sealing it. When I stopped, they nodded with the solemnity of ritual. "We are preparing them for transport," a woman said, "so what we carry can reach the right place." I said nothing. I had never liked being in the middle of other people's grief. It makes your job less like a job and more like a responsibility. On my last delivery, the house had a short driveway and a single lamppost that flickered. The porch smelled of coffee and something sweeter, like overripe fruit. A man in a sweater opened the door, and his face was too clean for that part of town. He took the package with a small smile and said, "You must come in. We will give you something for the road." I told him I could not stay. He looked disappointed in the way a person looks when a prayer goes unanswered. But he reached behind him and returned with a small paper cup with a lid. "Coffee," he said. "Ah, for you." I accepted because it was hard not to accept small kindnesses in the dark. The first sip burned the back of my throat and left a metallic aftertaste. Then something like a bell began to toll in the distance, 3 beats, slow and steady. The man closed the door, and from inside, I heard a choir of low, coordinated noises, people breathing together. I walked back to the van and sat with the engine off. The air on that street felt thicker, and the oscillating hum of the city receded into a silence that was full. I looked down at my hands and saw specks on my skin like dust, but moving. A notification blinked on my phone. The app had added a route stop I had not accepted. It placed an icon of a small church at the end of a dead-end road. The note read, "Communion. 045. Bring what you have." I could have turned the app off. I could have driven home. I did not. The dead-end road led to an old brick building with boarded windows. A single candle burned in the doorway. When I stepped inside, the air was warm and smelled like baking bread. A circle of people sat on folding chairs, faces lit by candlelight. They clapped in a rhythm that matched the bell I had heard earlier. One by one, they opened the packages they had been given. Inside were small items: a rusted key, a yellowed photograph, a child's shoe, a feather. Each person held their object like an offering and then handed it to the center of the circle. In the middle, there was a shallow bowl filled with water. The man who had offered me coffee gestured for me to sit. He held out his hands, and in them was an envelope. "Place what you carry here," he said. "We make sure nothing is lost." I looked at the parcel I had been carrying all night. It felt heavier than when I'd picked it up. Without thinking, I opened it. Inside, wrapped in paper, was a small doll with glassy eyes. Its head was matted with lint, and its dress had been sewn with thread that matched the logo on my uniform. In the circle, a woman began to hum. Another joined, their voices layered like the sound of people rising, and the humming turned into words that I could not understand and yet felt. They told me to place my hands in the bowl. I did. The water was cold and alive. It moved up my forearms like it had memory. For a second, I thought I felt threads, thin and warm, attached to the doll and then to the inside of my wrist. The man leaned in and said quietly, "We carry the fragments for them. If we forget, they find someone to remember." I wanted to pull my hands away. I wanted to drive until the sun came up and the app lost interest. But my fingers were soft, obedient. When I looked up, the circle had changed. Everyone's faces were older and younger at once, and there was a look of peace I could not parse. When I left the building, the bell had stopped. The streets were empty. My van smelled faintly of baking and something else I could not name. On the dashboard, a small feather lay where there had been nothing before. I kept it. I do not know why. I kept making the long deliveries after that. Sometimes the packages were ordinary. Sometimes they were small rituals. I never asked where the items came from or where they went once they were carried. There are things you cannot unsee in the night shift. There are things that find you. One night, near dawn, my app sent a final notification. "Thank you for transporting the last pieces," it said. I felt a pressure in my chest, like someone giving the smallest, most private bow. The feather on my dash turned to ash between my fingers. I do not deliver at night anymore.